Today we're going to explore a battle that changed the balance of power in Northern Europe, the legendary clash that propelled the Russian Empire to regional dominance, the Battle of Poltava, 1709. But before we begin, if you're passionate about history and want to join us on more fascinating journeys through time, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Thank you so much. And now, let's dive into the battle that rewrote the history of Northern Europe. In 1708, King Charles XII of Sweden invaded Russia with the goal of ending the Great Northern War. That winter, the Swedish army had to endure the harsh, freezing Russian weather and a severe shortage of food and supplies as the Russians implemented a scorched earth strategy, burning everything in their path. King Charles XII decided to move his forces southward into Ukraine. This was no coincidence. The young Swedish king chose to winter there because he had allied with Mazepa, the leader of the Ukrainian Cossacks, who saw Peter the Great's Russia as a rising threat that needed to be defeated. Charles IV also sought to form an alliance with Devlet-Girei III, the then Khan of Crimea, aiming to build a coalition against Russia. He believed that a united front of Swedes, Cossacks and Crimeans, along with reinforcements from Poland, which had already been defeated by Sweden, could triumph over Peter the Great's Russian Empire. With around 25,000 troops under his command, King Charles XIV pushed further south to position himself closer to the anticipated reinforcements from Poland. He then made the decision to besiege Poltava, a small town on the banks of the Vorskla River, located more than 300 kilometers southeast of Kiev, which was being defended by Colonel Alexei Kielan. On May 1, 1709, the Swedish army launched an attack on Poltava. After 6 weeks, their efforts had proven ineffective. Meanwhile, along the eastern bank of the Vorskla River, Russian forces were assembling. These included infantry under Field Marshal Boris Petrovich Sheremetev, cavalry under Duke Alexander Danilovich Menshikov, and artillery commanded by General Adolf Frederick Bauer. Russian and Swedish cavalry clashed daily along opposite sides of the Vorskla River, but neither side gained a clear advantage. Colonel Kielan informed the Russian generals that Poltava could only hold out until the end of June under constant Swedish assaults and siege pressure. Field Marshal Sheremetev and General Menshikov did not want to lose the town, but they were not adequately prepared for a pitched battle with the Swedes. Menshikov sent word to Tsar Peter the Great, who was marching with reinforcements from the Azov fortress. In early June, Peter the Great arrived at Duke Menshikov's camp with a large army. According to battlefield anomalies, the Russian force at that time numbered over 40,000 troops. The Tsar and his generals recognized that the fall of Poltava was only a matter of time. If the town fell to the Swedes, it could become a rallying point for an anti-Russian alliance and allow King Charles V to push deeper into Russian territory. Peter the Great and his generals resolved to commit the full Russian army to the defense of Poltava. However, to do so, they would first need to cross to the western bank of the Vorskla. On the night of June 14th, the first Russian crossing attempt was repelled. Poltava continued to report that it could not hold much longer, prompting Peter the Great to act urgently. The Swedes were well aware of the Russian attempts to cross the river. In the nights that followed, Swedish troops were ordered to remain on high alert. Their plan was to wait until a portion of the Russian army had crossed then use their numerical advantage on the western bank to drive them back. However, before this plan could be executed, disaster struck the Swedish king. On June 17th, which happened to be his 27th birthday, Charles V was drawn by the sounds of battle in the south of Poltava, where Russian forces were launching probing attacks. As he rode out to assess the situation, he was shot in the left leg. According to battlefield anomalies, Charles XIII initially refused to dismount in front of his troops, wishing to maintain appearances. However, he soon lost consciousness in the saddle due to blood loss. The injury not only compromised his health, but also severely impacted the morale of the Swedish army. Upon hearing of the king's injury, Marshal Carl Gustaf Rehnskiöld abandoned the planned northern assault. On the afternoon of June 17th, Peter the Great received news of Charles V's wounding and immediately gave the order to cross the river. On June 19th, Russian cavalry successfully crossed the Vorskla unopposed and established a defensive position at Semenovka, near Poltava. Between June 19th and 21, the entire Russian force crossed to the western bank and began constructing a defensive line. By June 22nd, the Swedish army had regained some of its composure. Though Charles IV had not yet recovered from his wound, his life was no longer in danger. At the same time, he received news that reinforcements from Poland would not arrive, and that the Crimean Tatars had been barred by the Ottoman Empire from cooperating with Sweden. The Swedish army continued to dwindle from skirmishes with no reinforcements in sight. Food supplies were nearly exhausted due to Russian scorched earth tactics. Gunpowder was damp and ammunition was running low. According to battlefield anomalies, Charles XIV planned to concentrate his remaining forces in a surprise attack on the Russians. Meanwhile, Peter the Great was focused on building a formidable defensive line that would force the Swedes into a costly frontal assault. On the night of June 26, Russian troops secretly moved south from Semenovka and established a new camp 6 kilometers north of Poltava. There they constructed a solid defensive fortification. Peter the Great took advantage of the surrounding terrain of forests, hills, and swamps to strengthen his position. Additionally, he ordered the construction of 6 forward redoubts, each manned by 700 troops and armed with 2 cannons. Behind these redoubts stood 7 cavalry regiments supported by 13 more cannon. On the evening of June 27th, King Charles V summoned his commanders to discuss plans for the upcoming battle. He acknowledged that the Russians had superior numbers, but believed the Swedes could win through bold tactics. The young king was confident they could defeat the Russians and even capture Peter the Great himself. The Swedish army had dwindled to about 25,000 troops, many of whom were sick and weak, due to lack of food and medicine. Löwenhaupt, the commander of the infantry, proposed committing the entire army to battle, but Charles V rejected the idea. The king explained that when 300 troops needed to continue the assault on Poltava to prevent the defenders from joining the Russian main force, another 2,000 cavalry were required to guard supply lines, and when 200 soldiers were to be positioned along the Vorskla below Poltava in case the Russians attempted another crossing. The 6,000 Cossack troops were not assigned any offensive role, as Charles V believed their undisciplined nature could disrupt the well-organized Swedish ranks. Thus, out of the 25,000 troops, Charles V committed only 19,000 to face over 40,000 Russians. When King Charles V was wounded, The position of supreme commander was assigned to Field Marshal Renskiold. According to several sources, Renskiold was hot-tempered, arrogant, and particularly disliked Count Löwenhaupt, the commander of the Swedish infantry. The plan devised by Charles V and Renskiold was a night attack aimed at taking the Russian army by surprise. The operation consisted of two rapid phases. First, to infiltrate the flat ground in front of the Russian main camp, and second, to launch a full-scale assault on the fortified encampment. The first phase was to begin before dawn, with Swedish troops swiftly bypassing the Russian outposts before the enemy could wake up. Infantry and cavalry were to advance together. The cavalry would eliminate the Russian cavalry guarding the rear of the outposts and then move to cut off the main Russian retreat route from the north. The infantry would follow, pushing through the outposts to attack the Russian fortifications. Directly, out of the 30 usable cannons, Renskiold decided to bring only 4. With a cavalryman's mindset, he disliked artillery and believed that hauling cannons through the Russian outposts would slow down the Swedish advance and ruin the surprise element of the operation. Around 1 a.m. on June 28th, while assembling the troops, the Swedes noticed sounds of digging from the Russian lines. Renskiold and a group of officers went to investigate and discovered that Russian troops were constructing 4 new redoubts, positioned perpendicular to the existing 6. This unexpected development posed a major problem. Continuing with the original plan would force the Swedish army to split into 2, with each group entering zones exposed to concentrated Russian artillery fire. As Renskiold observed the situation, Russian troops in 2 of the nearest redoubts spotted him. They opened fire and sounded the alarm with drums, alerting Peter the Great's forces. Renskiold quickly withdrew. The element of surprise was now lost, and time was running out for the Swedes. Renskiold, however, was determined to proceed with the attack before the opportunity slipped away entirely. King Charles V agreed, and the original plan was revised. The infantry was now divided into 5 columns. 4 of them would move quickly past the old redoubts and regroup on the flat ground as initially planned. The 5th column, consisting of 4 battalions, was tasked with assaulting the 4 newly built redoubts. At 4 a.m. Renskiold ordered the advance. The Swedish infantry marched toward the Russian redoubts, followed by the cavalry. The Swedes captured the first 2 redoubts. Several companies, after securing these positions, joined the troops moving past the right flank of the Russian redoubts, while others stayed behind to support Major General Carl Gustaf Rus, who was leading the assault on the 3rd redoubt. The Russian defenders at the 3rd redoubt resisted fiercely, repelling the first Swedish assault. More Swedish troops were committed, and eventually 6 battalions were thrown into the fight for this single redoubt. However, distrust among Swedish commanders deeply affected the operation. Renskiold did not communicate the full battle plan to his subordinates. Thus, General Rus believed his sole mission was to capture the redoubt, unaware that his real role was to draw Russian fire and allow the other Swedish columns to pass through safely. When his assault was repulsed, Rus and his men did not retreat to regroup on the flat ground as the plan required. Instead, they continued attacking the redoubt repeatedly, despite mounting losses. As a result, 6 battalions became bogged down in a strategically minor objective. While the Swedes were fighting at the redoubts, 2 Russian cavalry wings under General Menshikov suddenly charged out, attacking the Swedish infantry. The Swedish cavalry rushed to intercept them, After intense fighting, Menshikov believed he could rout the Swedes and sent a request to Peter the Great to mobilize the main Russian army along the redoubt lines. But Peter refused, suspecting that the Swedes might be hiding additional forces. Reluctantly, Menshikov ordered a retreat. He withdrew his cavalry northward, handing over most of the left flank of the Russian camp to General Adolf Frederick Bauer, while personally taking a smaller force to the right flank. From within the Russian fortifications, artillery fire covered the retreat, preventing the Swedish cavalry from pursuing. According to battlefield anomalies, Renskiold's failure to communicate the plan caused widespread confusion. Among the affected troops were 6 infantry battalions on the right, under Count Löwenhaupt. Their mission was simply to pass the redoubts and regroup on the flat ground, but the smoke and dust from the cavalry battle blinded them, while Russian redoubts opened fire on them. To minimize casualties, Löwenhaupt veered further to the right, away from the smoke and artillery range. This movement created a large gap in the Swedish formation. Still unaware of the full plan, Löwenhaupt continued, pushing forward toward the Russian main camp. After bypassing the redoubts, his 6 battalions moved even farther away from the main Swedish army. Löwenhaupt then advanced directly toward the Russian main encampment, intending to attack with just over 2,000 troops against a Russian army of over 30,000 plus. Meanwhile, on the far left, the main Swedish force, including 3 divisions under Renskiold, had successfully followed the original plan. They bypassed the redoubts and regrouped on the flat terrain. Renskiold was pleased with their progress, but waited in vain for the rest of the Swedish forces. The 12 battalions under Löwenhaupt and Reuss were missing. Renskiold sent messengers, ordering Löwenhaupt to return and regroup with the main force. Löwenhaupt, reluctant to abandon his assault on the Russian camp, finally obeyed. Renskiold now had 12 of his original 18 infantry battalions. The remaining 6, under General Reuss, were still trapped in the fight at the redoubts. Only when casualties reached nearly 50% did Reuss finally decide to retreat and rejoin the main army. But he had not been told where the army was. To reorganize, he marched his troops into a forest to the east. Renskiold's messengers couldn't locate Reuss's position, but Peter the Great could. Observing the situation closely, the Tsar ordered General Menshikov to lead 6,000 troops to attack Reuss's isolated detachment. When the first Russian units arrived, Reuss's men mistook them for Swedish reinforcements. By the time they realized the truth, the Russians were upon them. Overwhelmed by firepower and outnumbered, Reuss's troops were forced to surrender. Without even engaging in the main battle, a third of the Swedish infantry had been neutralized. Back at the front, the main Swedish army was still waiting, now under strength and exposed. Their position, less than 2 kilometers from the northwest corner of the Russian camp, was wide open and within range of Russian artillery. Heavy bombardment inflicted further casualties, forcing the Swedes to retreat into a forest to the south. Field Marshal Renskiold deeply regretted his earlier decision to leave most of the heavy artillery behind. Now, the Swedes had only 4 cannons facing 70 Russian guns. Renskiold sent messengers back to request artillery support from the rear, but to no avail. Around 9 a.m., Renskiold gave the order to retreat. The Swedish main army was weakened, and the risks of staying on the battlefield were too great. The Swedish field marshal intended to pull his troops back toward the Russian redoubts to reinforce, general ruse and attempt to break through to return to their original positions. After regrouping, Renskiold would summon the reserve battalions guarding the supply lines and patrolling the lower riverbank near Poltava. At that point, the Swedish army would number 24 battalions, twice its current strength, and Renskiold could then decide how best to launch an attack on the Russians. However, before Renskiold's troops could withdraw, Peter the Great ordered the Russian forces to launch a full-scale assault. The decisive confrontation between the two great armies, Russia and Sweden, had begun, with both Peter the Great and King Charles XII present on the battlefield. On the Russian right flank, General Bauer commanded 18 regiments of cavalry. On the left flank, Menshikov led 6 cavalry regiments. In the center stood the Russian infantry battalions under General Sheremetev and Prince Anikita Ivanovich Repnin. The Russian artillery had positioned several guns on the redoubts to support the infantry, while additional cannons were placed ahead of the infantry lines to clear the path forward. Realizing the Russians were advancing, Field Marshal Renskiold abandoned the withdrawal and ordered his troops to reform into a battle line. By around 10 a.m., the Swedish army had taken up battle formation. Infantry formed the front, followed by the cavalry. General Löwenhaupt's infantry force had been reduced to only 12 battalions, about 5,000 men. Opposite them stood 2 rows of Russian infantry, totaling over 24,000 soldiers, supported by 70 artillery pieces. The 12 Swedish battalions formed a thin line, attempting to stretch their formation wide enough to pierce through the Russian front. As they advanced, the Russians intensified their artillery fire. Despite their thin numbers, the Swedish infantry bravely pressed forward and managed to capture some of the forward Russian guns. At this point, Löwenhaupt's infantry had successfully breached a section of the Russian line. He expected the Swedish cavalry to charge in and reinforce the breakthrough, but no one arrived. The Swedish left flank was suffering heavily under relentless Russian artillery fire. The bombardment was so intense that their ranks were shattered before they could even reach the Russian infantry. While the left faltered, the Swedish right flank surged ahead, inadvertently creating a dangerous gap in the line. Peter the Great quickly spotted this opportunity and ordered a strong cavalry force to strike into the exposed gap. Without cavalry support, the Swedish infantry on the right was overwhelmed by the Russian horsemen. The deeper they pushed into enemy territory, the more they were surrounded by the numerically superior Russian troops. Eventually, the Swedish cavalry did arrive, but only about 50 horsemen. They were quickly cut down by Russian artillery and infantry fire. Panic spread through the Swedish ranks and many began to flee. Some isolated units continued to fight, but coordination between the Swedish cavalry and infantry on the right was poor. Meanwhile, a cavalry detachment sent to aid the left flank was also destroyed by Russian artillery. The battle dragged on for another half hour. Then the Swedish lines collapsed. Soldiers fled in all directions, ignoring the desperate commands of their officers. Field Marshal Renskiold was captured, while King Charles XIV, shielded by the remnants of his army, managed to escape back to the Swedish camp and eventually fled to seek refuge in the Ottoman Empire. Sweden entered the Battle of Poltava with around 19,000 troops, but lost nearly 10,000 men, including about 7,000 killed or wounded and over 2,700 taken prisoner. In contrast, Russian casualties were significantly lower, with around 1,300 killed and more than 3,200 wounded. The Russians had the advantage of fighting from fortified defensive positions while unleashing devastating artillery fire on the advancing enemy. The Russian victory at Poltava marked the end of the Swedish invasion of Russian territory and dramatically altered the political balance in Europe. Sweden lost its position as the dominant power in the Baltic region, a title that now passed to the rising Russian Empire. And that was the Battle of Poltava, a turning point that reshaped the balance of power in Northern Europe. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our upcoming history videos. See you next time on another journey through the past.